And so I'd like to go ahead and just introduce Anna. So Anna Mayer is not from Claremont, California. She does not make art about memory, time, or apocalypses of any kind. She does not make abstract or abstract expressionist paintings. Anna was not included in this year's Whitney Biennial. She did not receive the California Community Foundation grant for 2012. Anna is also not represented by Richard Tellez Fine Art in Los Angeles or Paula Cooper Gallery in New York, and she is not currently working towards any solo exhibitions. So if you'll help me giving Anna a warm round of applause.
This is not a TED Talk. This is not a pep talk. This is not an artist lecture. This is not a TEDx talk. This is not a sermon. This is not gospel. This is not a workshop. This is not diction for dollars. This is not an acceptance speech. This is not blue sky thinking. This is not word association. This is not televangelism. This is not a valedictorian's graduation speech. This is not a celebrity commencement address. This is not a yearly address to company shareholders. This is not a brainstorming session. This is not fully public speaking. This is not a conversation between lovers. This is not the pilot speaking to you about the weather in Chicago over the plane speaker system. This is not only a manifesto. This is not doctrine. This is not scripture. This is not a concession speech. I am not a believer. This is not a filibuster. This is not a toast. This is not a toast given at my sister's wedding reception. This isn't a prayer before a meal. This is not a dedication. This is not the first word. This is not an elegy. This is not a postscript, an aside, or a soliloquy. This is not the first thing I've done today. This is not the first time I've tried this. This isn't a curse or a hex or a summary of some longer narrative. This is not a stand-in. This isn't ghost written. This isn't the only version of this. These words aren't spoken at a bedside with no time to lose. This is not a durational experiment. I am not cynical. I am not a scholar. I am not a PhD candidate. This is not spontaneous. This is not extemporaneous speech. This is not off the cuff. This is not stand-up comedy. This is not a conference call. This is not a way out. This is not an escape route. This is not the only way in. This is not a rant. This is not hate speech. I'm not wealthy. I'm not poor. I'm not upwardly mobile. I'm not moving slowly. I'm not single. This is not a stump speech. This is not a drunken plea to get back together. I'm not married. I'm not divorced. I'm not a temp. I'm not an intern. I'm not a volunteer. I'm not winning. I'm not Michelle Obama. I'm not Julian Assange. I'm not addressing you from an embassy balcony. I am not tired. I am not trying too hard. This is not an apology. This isn't a defensive move. This is not a live report from on location. This is not a roundtable discussion. I am not a mother. I am not desperate. I am not content. This is not a Q&A session after the main event. I am not done talking. I am not on my own. I am not always scared. I am not intolerant. I am not at one with the dominant morals of this culture. I am not separate from others. I am not afraid to think for myself. I am not Emma Goldman. This is not a voiceover. This is not a challenge. This isn't doctrine for dollars. This isn't advocating for a certain lifestyle. I am not a substitute teacher. I am not an expatriate. I am not a townsperson. I'm not a producer. I'm not an eco-warrior. I'm not a collector of culture. I am not at my worst. This is not a new way of doing things. This is not a general assembly. These are not introductory remarks. This is not how it always will be. This is not an open mic. This is not an unscheduled announcement. This is not a staff briefing. This is not horizontal. I am not thinking. I am not rehearsing a one-woman play. I am not in training of any kind. I'm not standing before you in shame. This is not a rally. This is not a trial. This is not a sign-making meetup or a drive-time monologue. I am not recounting my family history. I'm not giving you a timeline. I am not keeping time. This isn't describing a better way to be in the world. This isn't a Toastmasters speech. I am not Barack Obama. I am not Padu Paga. I am not John Cage. I'm not a lawyer. I am not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. I am not a seasoned professional. I'm not adjunct faculty. I am not a radicalized sex worker whose rights you think you can assign. I am not exactly a guest speaker. I am not a folk singer. I'm not an expert. This isn't a talking head. This isn't a rebuttal. This is not psychic communication. This is not an outburst. This is not an empty threat. This is not all there is to say on the subject. This is not the last word. I am not the best judge of this situation. I am not passing judgment. I am not arranging flowers for you. I am not harvesting any crops this year. I'm not a starving artist. I am not an amateur. I'm not a crook. I'm not pure. I am not filled with dread. I am not too worried. I'm not a crook. I am not an architect. I'm not a designer. I'm not working on a screenplay. I'm not a Buddhist. I am not the favorite. I am not late. Right this minute, I am not waiting for anything. I am not anywhere else. I'm not calm. I'm not chilly. I'm not chatting. I am not trying to charm you. I'm not boring. I am not an atheist. I'm not out of breath. I am not lonely. I'm not an enthusiast. I'm not a fascist. I'm not a dictator. I'm not leading you right now. I'm not your mother. I'm not an instrument. I'm not here so that we can agree. So in tonight's presentation, I'll be sharing with you some of my lateral research on the topic of the negative assertion. So my interest in this subject initially came from exposure to the negative confessions in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And since I saw that, I've slowly been gathering other examples. And now I call this the negative assertion method. And so I'll show you some of these. It's ongoing research. I have some conclusions, and I also have a lot of questions. So As is the case with much of the culture that is meaningful to me, I came across the idea of the negative assertion randomly. So it wasn't by accident, really, but it was associatively. I was doing a Google search for something else. I'm an artist who makes sculpture and performance. I usually use some kind of text or language in my work, and I have an interest specifically in how language becomes materialized and how it can further embodiment. So I often write for the art that I make, and my composition practice is very related to reading and listening. I do a lot of research and searching and dreaming, and then eventually I write. And so it was during one of these research periods, Googling periods, that I came across the negative confessions, which, as I mentioned, are found in the Book of the Dead. And so for those of you who don't know, the Book of the Dead is a funerary text that was written in order to assist a person who's died in moving through the underworld into the afterlife. So the text is very magical, and the negative confessions are actually meant to be recited during the weighing of the heart ritual. They're meant to express the speaker's pureness. So there are 42. They're tiny here, but I pulled out some examples to show you how they work. So number one is, I have not sinned against men. I have not domineered over slaves. I have slain no man. I have not encroached upon the fields of others. I have not caught fish with the bait of their bodies. So if you have any familiarity with the Ten Commandments, you'll notice that although they're basically doing the same things, the negative confessions and the Ten Commandments are structured very differently. So that's another one. So the Ten Commandments, it's small here, but you remember it's like, thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not steal. So the Ten Commandments are structured in a way where the deity on high is giving directives to the faithful. Whereas the negative confessions are the moral code has been internalized by the faithful and who is speaking it themselves. It's spoken from the believer's perspective. So I got interested in this structure a few years ago, and almost immediately I used one of the negative confessions in a stop-motion animation that I made. So I think I was interested in just sort of having some time to contemplate this way of doing things, and so I made this. So a more recent example of the negative affirmation method happened early this fall when a Los Angeles artist, Addie Tennell, put out a call for participation in a day of panel discussions at the Anarchist Book Fair that happens every year. So Addie sent out a invitation for both participants and panel members. And it gave all the information about when the discussions were happening, which was Saturday, September 8th, at the book fair, etc. And then it also contained this text that Addie had written. So it's impossible to read here, so I'll read it aloud to you. It says, "Fuck art. Fuck every museum, gallery, artist-run space. Fuck the word contemporary art, the word art, the fucking word conceptual. Fuck the fucking situationists. Fuck trippy crust drawings, punk propaganda, punk doodles of your friends. Fuck art school, duh. Fuck participatory art, community art, food art, performance art. Fuck socially engaged art. Fuck the word dialogical. Fuck graphic design, poster art. Seriously though, fuck posters. Fuck sculpture, trash sculptures, found objects, new fucking genre. Fuck activist art, ad jamming, billboard reclamation. Fuck gory metal doodles, even if it's in a toilet stall. Fuck craft art, yarn bombing. Fuck, fuck, fuck painting, all painting, even if it's cute. Fuck photography, video art, documentaries, film, fucking art house everything. Oh my God, fuck puppets. Fuck fucking outsider art, fuck stencil font, fuck fonts. Fuck street art so hard, fuck street art. Fuck murals, tagging, graffiti. Fuck political graphics, fuck the fucking raised fist. Fuck the black flag, fuck the circle A, fuck art. So, I think it's both the humor and the nihilism of Addie's text that appeal to me. I mean, I find it funny because I'm in this kind of narrow population of people who are contemporary art obsessed and immersed. And I imagine many of the activists and anarchists who received this found it funny as well. So the humor is sort of like for a narrow population, but I found it really to be a hopeful text. And so the act of putting this statement together with an invitation to come and contemplate art for a whole day was a really nice gesture. And to me, it was about kind of like making space for art to do something new, or at least for a dialogue about what art could do that it hasn't been doing. And the kind of all-inclusiveness of the negative assertion in this text makes that space. So this idea of crossing things out has particular importance in contemporary life. We are fully in late capitalism, and there are so many choices in the world, and we're completely overstimulated all the time. And at this point in capitalism, there has to be this illusion of choice maintained at all times. And usually it's individuals who kind of bear the burden of that illusion, because with all the advertising and all the candy bars, it's like tough going. And so I think for me, it's very common that I use a process of elimination almost daily, if not hourly, to help myself negotiate all of the choices. We see so much. It is not all for us. Not all of it is for us. So we have this level of diversity, and it means that we must kind of cultivate a certain kind of tolerance, but we also need the process of elimination. So this overstimulation is something that's addressed very overtly in New Age thinking, which has as one of its missions to bring attention to how we internalize the cues and messages of all the advertising that we're exposed to from birth. Positive affirmation culture has been around for a few decades now. It's very familiar. It's been absorbed by the market so fully that it's sold back to us in all these different contexts. So it's a little bit hard to tune into its subtleties now. But I want to tonight because positive affirmation culture proposes something that's really relevant to the negative assertion method, which is that speech is powerful and that what we say can create or change reality. We're going to watch a clip, like a 2-minute clip of Louise Hay, who is a book publisher and a public speaker, like classic New Age positive affirmation guru. The Australian government pronounced her the closest thing they have to a saint. I don't know why, because she's not Australian, but anyway, she articulates these ideas really clearly about how words can create the future.
Well, the simple part that most people don't understand is that every thought we think and every word we speak is creating our future. It's as though our thoughts go out into the universe and are accepted and brought back to us as experience. Now that is a very simple thing, but most people don't get it. They don't understand it. They've never heard it before and they think it's ridiculous. But if you can really accept the fact that every time you think a thought and every time you speak a word, you are literally painting your future, making your dinner, whatever you want to call it. You are creating. And you're creating your own life. And this is simple, but it's not easy to accept. But once you accept it, then you can start deliberately creating what you want in your life. And you begin to be aware of what you don't want in your life and how you are contributing to it. Now, I think this has been around forever, but for some reason in the last 20 years, the universe has wanted this to go out among all the people, or all the people that are ready for it. See, most of us just think, and we don't pay any attention to what we're thinking. We're just doing it. But that's something you need to train yourself to do, to begin to train yourself to be aware of what you're thinking. And one of the ways to do that is to periodically say to yourself, what am I thinking? Would I like this thought to create my life? Would I like to have the experience that this thought could bring to me? Now, it takes a while to do that, but even if we could begin on the smallest level to be aware of our thinking, we can start to make changes.
Okay, so Louise Hay, she's very articulate. I mean, what she's talking about has become so ubiquitous that a lot of us kind of subscribe to it without necessarily knowing where it comes from. I want to show you one more video because it's a nice example of how ubiquitous this way of thinking is. And this is an extremely popular YouTube video from the early 2000s.
Look, I can be a circ. Now my whole house is great. I can do anything good. I like my school. I like anything. I like my dad. I like my cousins. I like my aunts. I like my Allisons. I like my moms. I like my sisters. I like my dad. I like my hair. I like my haircuts. I like my pajamas. I like my stuff. I yeah, yeah, yeah. I can do anything good, better than anyone, better than anyone.
So they recently came out with the high definition version of that. So Jessica is like a really young convert, but the pressure to think positive is everywhere. It's in our healthcare system, it's in our schools, and it's in our churches. And so with that, I want to talk about another positive affirmation movement. It's called Word of Faith, and it's a movement within Christianity. It has a lot of overlap with prosperity theology, with the charismatic movement and the Pentecostal church, and it's been around since the early 70s. It's very evangelical, it's very late night, huge gatherings in mega churches, and its pastors sell a lot of product. So Word of Faith emphasizes speaking, stating, and confessing verses found in the Bible called the Word of God. And this movement coined the term positive confession. So this is no doubt in reaction to the idea of the negative confession. I'll give you an example. So Charles Capps is one of the major pastors. He wrote this book among many called The Tongue, A Creative Force. And so he tells this story about how in his church it was like confession time, and a member of his congregation stood up and said that she felt like she was getting the flu. So it's like whatever's on your mind, this was on her mind. And the rest of the congregation looked at her and said, yeah, like your eyes are glassy and you seem a little sniffly. Yeah, you probably have the flu. And as far as Charles Capps is concerned and the Word of Faith movement is concerned, this is like the last thing you want to say. So he says, wouldn't it be much simpler to stand up and say, well, the enemy's been trying to put the symptoms of the flu on me and cause me to believe in it. But I stand before you tonight, and you are my witnesses before the angels and before God and before heaven that I am not sick. I'll not have the flu. By the stripes of Jesus, I'm healed. That settles it, thank you. The word says I'm healed. That's good enough for me. So, in a way that's extremely similar to New Age thinking, this movement believes that words have power and speech has power, and that what you say determines everything that happens to you. And so specifically, your confessions to God should be stated emphatically and in the positive. And if you confess in that way, God is required to answer. So there's obvious overlaps with New Thought, which is what we now know as positive thinking. And then also it's worth noting that there are a lot of overlaps with the occult. So like all of the spell casting and incantation practices in the occult are very similar to this. So the Word of Faith movement is the focus of quite a bit of controversy within its kind of branch of Protestantism, and the details of the controversy make clear some of the differences between positive and negative assertion. So part of the controversy is that Word of Faith is exactly parallel with prosperity theology, which I mentioned before, which has always been the focus of heavy criticism because of its focus on the attainment of material wealth and the acquisition of earthly power. So this is like the Oral Roberts tradition, the Kenneth Hagin that some of us in this room grew up with watching on television. Prosperity theology is so controversial, and also Word of Faith and the positive confession is so controversial that in the early 80s, something called the General Council of the Assemblies of God published a document that criticizes the doctrine of positive confession, and it lists these examples of negative confessions that are found in the Bible that are successful. Kenneth Hagin is Prosperity Theology. This is one of his books. So the council just listed all these different examples of non-positive confessions that worked out. So King Jehoshaphat admitted that he had no might against an enemy alliance, but God gave him a marvelous victory anyway. In the Corinthians, Paul admitted weakness and then stated that when he was weak, he was strong because God's strength is made perfect in weakness. And then the story that a lot of us know, when the disciples realized they didn't have enough food to feed the masses and admitted their weakness, and Christ provided a more than adequate supply. So the council really wanted to make the case that positive confession isn't the only way to get God's ear. They say comparing scripture with scripture makes it clear that positive verbal expressions do not always produce happy effects, nor do negative statements always result in unhappy effects. So the positive affirmation and positive confession movements indicate that speech can create reality. And so with the next few examples, I want to bring the negative assertion back into it, and so that we can think about how it might have the same capacity for transformation, expression, and creativity. George Lakoff is a cognitive linguist who has a long career writing about linguistics and philosophy, and one of his main focus has always been metaphor and language. More recently, he focuses on the idea of framing, which is not his original idea, but he's taken it up strongly. Interestingly, in the last several years, Lakoff has been leaving the academy periodically to work with the Democratic Party as a strategist to try to help, in his words, rehabilitate the party's ability to articulate its platform in the face of really extreme conservative Republican rhetoric. So he's been doing that. He also writes for mainstream online media about this idea of framing. So basically, framing establishes that all words exist in a context with a narrative, and the frame provides ready-made relationships between words. So I'll just go through the 3 rules of framing with examples, and this kind of illustrates it best. So the first rule of framing is that every word has a frame. So language is not neutral, but rather every word carries with it a set of values that can be decoded. So the phrase tax relief is a great example of this, and it's one that Lakoff commonly uses to illustrate how language is coded. The term tax relief was introduced by the Bush administration, and when you decode it, you quickly see that the idea of relief indicates that taxes are something that we need to be relieved of, and that taxes are bad. And so this is something that conservative Republicans certainly believe, but other political perspectives don't. And so in the case of a phrase like tax relief, Lakoff advised the Democratic Party to introduce other language into the conversation. Under no circumstances are they ever to use that term, and that they should find other ways to talk about taxation. The second rule of framing is that negating a frame evokes that frame. The phrase, "don't think of an elephant," is a perfect example of this. The minute you say that, all you can think of is an elephant. The third rule is evoking a frame reinforces that frame. So Nixon's "I am not a crook" is a good example of this. When you're arguing with the other side, you don't ever want to use its frame. And so Nixon being a crook was the other side's idea, but then he went on national television, and the way that he tried to deny it evoked their frame. It evoked the idea of his criminality and burned it into the public's mind forever. I like the way that George Lakoff is like not a neutral academic. A lot of people attribute some positive things that have happened with the liberals to some of his ideas. This is how direct he is. As far as my thinking goes, I see how Lakoff's ideas have relevance for our political process the way that it exists now, because it exists almost entirely in sound bites. In sound bites, you have to be so precise that you need to deal with the idea of framing. But I wonder if, on a smaller scale, the negative assertion or evoking the frame in order to turn away from it might have more value. So this is something that comes up in protest. I want to talk about Occupy Wall Street as a protest that tried really hard to resist the soundbite trap, and also the issue of negative assertion as it comes up in Occupy Wall Street. So sometimes a negative assertion is simply a rebuttal. Sometimes you have to evoke the frame head on because the frame simply isn't true. And evoking it is a way to expose its absurdity. If you can't read that, it says, "My sign isn't big enough to fit all the things that I'm pissed off about." So Lakoff was actually approached by some members of Occupy Wall Street early on in the movement, and they asked him for help in framing the movement's platform. And he wrote a really eloquent response to this that he kind of refused, but then did it anyway. But the reason that he refused was that he supported the movements. He supported the way that early on the movement wasn't making demands and actively refused to make kind of coherent, sound-biteable demands. Okay, so the Occupy movement is a good example of the negative assertion at work, and this is actually what kind of garnered it a lot of criticism. Early on, people in sort of all different walks of life were criticizing the movement sort of for this reason, that it was pointing out all of these ills in our culture and in our society and in the government and in the banking system, but it wasn't making any move towards offering a solution. And this came from all sides. This is a blog from October 10th, so 10 days into the Zuccotti Park encampment. It says, "Occupy Wall Street highlights problems, offers no solutions." And it says, "The Occupy Wall Street protest continues and has been spreading to other cities. It is obvious that the protesters are unhappy with the economy, the lack of jobs, and corporate greed. It's a good thing for people to protest when they think something in this country needs fixing. Sadly, their protests, at least at this point in time, offer no real solutions to the problem." Another example, this was like a month, this is from a report a month later. Brad Pitt was doing a movie tour, and but he kind of like stopped talking about the movie Moneyball and started talking about the Occupy movement, and he says, "What you're seeing in America is questioning a system that has not served us well." But then he goes on to say that he's not signing on with the movement completely, because the most important thing is really not just getting swept up in the fervor of a fight. And if you're going to say one guy's bad, you've got to back it up with this is how we fix it. So I'm not suggesting that Brad Pitt is an expert. I'm not saying he's not, but I'm just using this as an example of how this argument was kind of prevalent at the beginning and throughout the first stage of Occupy. And it's actually an argument that I've heard before, having been through a few art schools, and now I'm starting to teach classes where we have critiques of student work. And often I've seen when there's a work of art that is critical in its strategy, so it's in whatever way, whether it's a painting or a video or a performance, it's pointing out some sort of problem in culture or in some kind of system. And I've heard it so often in crits where eventually in the conversation where people are discussing this piece of art, eventually someone gets frustrated and says, well, okay, I get that there's a problem, but what are you offering as a solution? What should we do then? If we can't do what we've been doing, what should we do then? And when I first started hearing this, when I was first in art school, I was kind of like, oh, I guess humans are just like solution-oriented, or we really want resolution. But now, especially after seeing it leveled in the Occupy movement, I think it's more of, it can be a rhetorical device meant to shut down a conversation. So as long as you're just being negative and you're not being positive, it's not a productive space in which to have a conversation. So the last example of negative assertion that I want to share with you tonight is a fairly everyday one. I came across this interview with a producer, a music producer named Don Dixon, who I had never heard of, but he's been working with artists for a long time, and so as a producer and a recording engineer, he basically helps people sound like themselves. And over the decades that he's been recording people, he's come up with this practice of asking the artists who he's working with not who they want to sound like, but who they don't want to sound like. And so I just excerpted this interview that a singer-songwriter who he had worked with interviewed Don Dixon, and she said to him, early on you asked me to think about not who I am or who I think I want to be, but who am I not? And this stuck with me and helped me identify myself. Do you remember the question? Do you ask everyone this? And he replied, I use a variety of approaches when I'm working with artists. Often they've existed and created in such a vacuum that they have trouble with perspective. It's difficult to step outside oneself enough to see the big picture. One way I try to help lend perspective is by emphasizing the simple fact that no one appeals to everyone. No matter how successful one becomes, millions either don't know about you, don't care about you, or even actively despise you. The ones that actively despise you are valuable because it helps define to whom you do appeal. So trying to understand who you are is not a big step toward So trying to understand who you are not is a big step toward understanding who you are and who your fans might be. I'm not sure when this occurred to me, but probably at some point when I realized how Madonna's detractors helped define her and how hard she tried to piss people off. So when I read this interview, I thought it was really interesting that someone in his field had kind of happened upon this way of engaging with the people he's working with. And he's working within this highly commercial industry, but also it's a creative industry. But I read it and then immediately began to wonder how his strategy might apply to groups. And whether he had developed this strategy as a way of soliciting information from bands that he'd worked with. So when it wasn't just a single singer, but it was a group of people who have to articulate themselves as a group, and they all have to kind of speak for the group, but, and might find this easier to do in the negative rather than in the positive. I don't know if this is the case, but I started thinking about the negative assertion as a way that groups could potentially articulate themselves more creatively. So at this point, I'd like to move into the third and last session of the evening, and I ask that you join me in considering the negative affirmation method. So I've come up with a very, very simple exercise in group thinking. I invite you to step up to the second mic and answer the question, who are we? So your answer will take the form of a negative assertion. In other words, we are, or potentially we will not be. And so this is your opportunity to temporarily define this temporary gathering, and think in the negative affirmation way, and also do it collectively. So I ask the question, who are we? We are.
We are not smizing.
We are not politicians, we are not farmers, we are not smurfs.
We are not only anything.
We are not seceding. This is not a love song.
We are not together.
We are not apart.
We are not a class in a school.
We are not cutting cake. We are not eating latkes. We are not serving each other tea.
We are not watching television. We are not on the phone. We are not dead. We are not asleep. We are not eating wine and cheese. We are not drinking beer.
We are not a focus group. We are not consuming.
We're not gonna take it.
We're not trying to get an A. We're not trying to be the perfect wife. We're not trying to stuff each other's mouths.
We are not thinking about what it would be like to have an orgy in here in just a few minutes.
We are not taking it lying down.
We are not doing it right here against the wall.
We're not resting.
We're not all coworkers. We're not all roommates. We didn't all carpool here together.
We're not swimming. We're not drowning.
We're not waiting for something to happen.
Okay, thank you all for coming.